everyone, and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to be creating our login form. Now, in our previous video where we were creating the registration form, our users were simply coming to a registration page, filling out the information like email address and the password that they want to use, and that information was being submitted to our server. And of course, that submission was creating an application user out on our database. Now, this creation of the application user on the database was being handled by the user manager class. And the user manager class comes with ASP.NET Identity Core. Then after the application user was created on the database, the application user was then being passed along to the session that the user was being logged into. Now, this management of the session was being handled by the sign-in manager. Again, another class that is being created or as part of the ASP.NET Identity Core. Now, when it comes to the login form that we create, there's going to be some similarities, but there's also going to be some differences. So once again, our user is going to be coming to the login page this time, and that login page is going to be passed along to our server. The server then, instead of creating an application user out on the database, instead it's going to be asking whether or not the information that the user submitted is correct and belongs to an application user. Then the database gives us back a response as to whether or not it was a good login or a bad login. And if it's a bad login, then we could redirect the user back to the login page or maybe somewhere else. But if it's a good login, then we once again want to pass along that information to the session state. Now, previously, when we were dealing with the registration process, the database was being handled by the user management class. But in this case, both the session and the database are both being managed by the sign-in manager. So to see how this all works and to create our login form, let's go ahead and hop into our Visual Studio Code window. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is inside of our account controller, we're going to add some new actions here. So the first one we're going to do is just an HTTP GET, and this is going to be our public iActionResult login. And this is just going to be the landing page that we want users to go to whenever they need to log in. And just like how we had with the register action where we just returned a view, that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. Now, before I go and create that view, let's go ahead and create the view model that we're going to bind that view to. So let's go ahead and go to our view models folder, and I'm going to add a new class, and I'm just going to call this the login view model. As of right now, this only needs two properties. So we're going to do a prop of string, and it's going to be the email address that the user needs to type in, as well as their password. So we'll do prop, and it's going to be a string of password. Now we need to add some annotations to this, or some attributes. So the first one is that I think both of these should be required. So let's go ahead and bring that in. I need to bring in the namespace, so I'm going to hit Control period here on required, and I'm going to say using the system component model data annotations. And I could just do the same thing here for the password. And now for the email address, I can also put the annotation of email address. And here for the password, we want to obscure this, and the way that you do that is by saying that the data type we're specifying the data type as a password, and the tag helpers will actually pick this annotation up and cause it to be a password type in the input. That's why when we did the registration page, the password part was being obscured by the little dots, right? When we got the little stars when you type in the password in an input box, that's because the input type is actually a password type, and by having this data type password as an annotation, the helper tags automatically pick this up and make that a password input type. So that looks good for now. I'm going to clear out some of these usings by just right-clicking and going to Organize Usings and Remove and Sort. We'll save that, And now we need to go ahead and create our view. So I'm going to go down to Views, and under the Account subfolder here where we built our registration page, I'm going to go ahead and add a new item. This is going to be a ASP.NET MVC view page. And this is just going to be called Login. Okay? So let's go ahead and set the model. We're going to use the model declaration here to say that this is going to use the login view model. And now let's go ahead and add an H2 tag here. And we're going to say this is the login page. You can obviously put a title here, whatever you want. And actually, don't forget, we still have, for our shared layout, remember how in our layouts we already have the title being shown here in an H2 tag. So really I'm being redundant here, as we saw with the registration page. The login page could also be set there, so maybe that's a good idea, that instead of using the H2 tag there, we'll just make sure that we set it back here in our controller. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say the view bag title is actually equal to the login page. That way we're using that layout that we've got instead of specifying it here. So let's go ahead and delete that H2 there. And now we need to make a form just like we did before with our registration page. Let's add a little room here. And now we need to, again, we're going to say method should be post. That's right. We do want to use the post action verb to post back to our account controller, and we'll make up that action that's going to receive the login action, or the login, the submit button from this form. We'll create that next login action in just a moment. But right now, what we need to do is we also need to specify the ASP action is going to be, let's see, it's going to be login, and then the controller is going to be ASP-controller is going to be the account controller. Because again, account is the name of the controller, right? Account controller, and login is the name of the action that we're going to be posting this information to. So let's go ahead and start building up our form here. The first thing that we want is, just like again we had with the registration, we want some sort of validation summary in case there was an error. So we're going to do a div here and say ASP validation summary, and we're going to say is going to be for everything. Okay, and next up we need to add another div here, and this one is going to be for our email address. So I'm going to do a label first. And this label is going to be, and we can again use the tag helpers here, so ASP4, and this is going to be for our email property that is on our login view model. Okay, so we're going to say we're going to give it a label first, then after that we're going to go ahead and give it the input box, and again we're going to say ASP4 email. All right. And then I'm also going to add the span tag here. That's going to be another ASP validation for specifically the email property. So if there was a problem with the email, when the user comes back to this page, they're going to get that validation message right here next to or underneath the input of the email. Okay, so it's just very helpful to do that. Let's go ahead and add another div tag here, and this is going to be where the user is going to put in their password here. So we'll do label, and again it's the same thing as we did for the email, so this should be pretty simple. Password, and next up we're going to do the input tag, ASP4 password. All right, and then lastly we're going to add that span ASP validation for. And this is again the password. Okay. Then one last item that we need here inside of our form is a submit button. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to do another div. And this is just going to have inside of it another input. And the input type is going to be submit. That way this actually submits the form. And let's say the value is going to be login. Okay, Alright, so there is our view. Now when the submit button is clicked to go ahead and log in, it's going to post this form. It's going to use the post action verb to post back to our account controller, and it's going to look for a login action that takes the action verb of HTTP post. So let's go ahead and get started on that HTTP post. And this again is going to be a public action result. But this time we're going to be using some model binding because this login page is going to be passing in the email and the password, which means it's going to be passing in a type of login view model, which means we can bind the response of this post to a login view model, and I'm just going to call it a VM for view model. And this is probably going to be looking pretty familiar to you, like what we did down here with the register, right, where we were doing some model binding here by having the register view model and just calling it VM. That's the same thing that we're doing here with our login. So just like before, the first thing that we should do is just make sure that the data that's been bound to our view model is good. So we're going to do check if the model state is valid. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump down here and say, I think I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here, and I'm going to say that if it is valid, we're going to do something inside of this, but if it's not valid, then return the user back to the login screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a return view, and I'm going to pass the view model back in. Okay? Now what needs to happen here is something a little different than what we did with the registration, because with the registration we actually needed to both update the database with what the user had picked, right, for a username and password, and then we also needed to put that basically in the session state for the user so that we could dictate that the user had logged in, right? So we were here with the user manager create async, we were actually creating the user in the database, and then here with the sign in manager we were basically putting on their session something that said that they were logged in. In this case, we're not really actually going to be saving the data to the database. Instead, we're going to be asking the database to confirm that we are in fact okay to log in. But it turns out that the sign-in manager actually can do this for us. It's going to check the database and see if the information that the user put in is valid compared to what we have for them in the database. So we don't need to make a user manager call here. We simply need to ask the sign-in manager to see if the information is correct, and it will handle everything behind the scenes to also log that person in for the session. So I'm going to scroll back up here to after we've checked to see if the model state is valid, we're going to create a new result object that's going to return the result of, and this is going to be the sign-in manager, password, sign-in async, okay? And this expects a few things, and there's two different overrides here. We could try to go find the specific application user as an object, or in this case, I'm just going to pass in the user name, which happens to be the email address as well. Because remember, we used username and email address to basically designate the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in VM, email. The next one is the password, so we need to pass in a password string, which again the user supplied to us as the password property. And now we see this is persistent. That is an indication that we could actually allow the user to persist this login if they decide to exit the website. Now that gets stored as a cookie on their system, and then when the user comes back, that cookie is referenced back to the, as part of the authentication process. It will see that there's a cookie and that the user has already been logged in, and it will verify that information for us. So we could actually have the user persist that information to their browser. Now right now, I could just manually set that, but something you might want to do is allow the user to decide this for themselves. So I'm going to actually go ahead and add that in as an option right now. In order to do that, I'm going to go back to my login view model, and I'm going to go ahead and add another property. Now this is going to be of a type Boolean, and I'm going to go ahead and call this remember me. Okay, so that's just going to be what it is. It's just an option for the user to ask to remember me. Now, I'm also going to add another annotation here, because remember we were using, back here in our login view, we were using the labels, and we were getting the name of each control item in our form based upon this ASP4, right? So I need to also dictate back here on our login view model what the display name should be for remember me, because email and password were just one word, but remember me is 2 words, and I probably want it to display as having a space in there. So I'm going to say display name equals remember me. Okay, so with that change in place on our view model, let's go back to our view and give the user the option of saving this. So I'm going to go ahead and add another div here, and the label ASP4 remember me, and the input ASP4 remember me, and finally we'll go ahead and add, for posterity's sake, I don't know that you could really get this one wrong, but we're going to add it in here anyway, some sort of validation message. Okay, so now our view is fixed, our view model is fixed, and now we can associate, or we can put in as the parameter for that is persistent, the value that the user selected for remember me. Now, lockout on failure, I'm going to say is false. I don't want them to lock the user out if they get it wrong. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do that. Now, this is not going to work right off the bat, and this is again similar to what we did with the registration. Notice that we had to make our registration HTTP post a type of async action that returned a type of task of iAction result, and we use the await keyword both here in front of our user manager and our sign-in manager, because the methods that we were calling were async methods. And that's the same thing with what we're going to have to do up here. For our password sign-in async, we need to make this awaitable, and we need to say that the action is async, and it's going to return a type of task of iAction result. Now with that in place, we can go ahead and after the login attempt is completed, we can go ahead and check to see if the result succeeded. So if the attempt to log in succeeded, then what do we want to do? Well, let's go ahead and just simply return the user back to what? Well, I think for this case, let's go ahead and do a redirect to action. And let's go ahead and say the index action on the home controller. Okay, so that'll just take them to the home controller. Now, what if the result did not succeed? So what if we had a problem here and they don't get this redirect to action, and maybe they put in the wrong password or something like that? Well, I could do an else statement here, but that's just a little redundant. I can just go ahead and do return view the VM, but I should probably add as some sort of model error that there was a problem logging them in. So I'm going to go ahead and add to the model state and add a model error, and this is just going to be an invalid login attempt. Okay, and that'll actually post up to the validation error messages that we have back here on our login screen. That'll post right up here where our validation summary is, because it doesn't apply to an email, password, or the remember me property. And when we just simply say a blank string like this, it'll go ahead and show up here in the validation summary, but it won't show up for any one of these. Okay, If we did want it to show up for one of these, like maybe for the password, then we could go ahead and say this is a validation message for the password. But that's not really the case. We're kind of getting it for everything. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's save everything, and let's go ahead and run our application here and see what we get. So let's go ahead and go to the account, login, and for our account login, let's try the steve@contoso.com, and I'm going to put in a wrong password here, and I'll go ahead and click on the remember me and try logging in. Now I don't want to save that, but we can see invalid login attempt. Okay, so let's try this one. This is going to be the actual password. This is going to be the correct password. So SSWRD1 exclamation, log in, and that should bring us back to the home page. Sure enough, we're back to the main page of our website, which means that I logged in properly. Now, one last thing I'd like to add here for our login screen is a way for people who might be coming to this. They may not be able to log in because they haven't yet registered. So what I can do to make things a little easier so that every time I want the user to log in whenever they need to log in, and if they haven't registered yet, they can all go to the same page, and then from here I give them the option to register. So to do that, let's go back to, let's go ahead and close this down and stop our application. And I'm going to go to my login view here. Now inside of my login view, I'm actually going to split this up a little bit more. I'm going to wrap p tags around this login button, and I'm going to do the same thing around another button that I'm going to put in here, and this is going to be an anchor tag, which is going to be an ASP action, and the action is going to be for register, right? And that's going to redirect them to the registration page. Now I could also add the ASP controller is going to be our account controller, but since they're actually both coming from the same controller, our login action and our register action are really the same, coming from the same controller, I don't actually need to do that. So I'm just going to leave off the ASP controller as part of the tag helper there. And I'm just going to say register as the name of this anchor. Now this is not a button, but it's going to show up as a link, but that should still work. So let's go ahead and run our application again, and let's just see if this registration link works for us. So we'll try once again our account login page, and now we can see there's the option to register, and that redirects us to the registration page. Now, if you're wondering how to make this register link turn into a button, we will be getting into this when we start talking about Bootstrap, because you can actually turn links into buttons, and you can do some really cool styling things with Bootstrap. So for right now, I think that's going to do it as far as creating our login page. Up next, we're actually going to see how to use this login information, how to know when a user is logged in to start securing different sections of our application. I'd like to give special thanks to James McCoy, whose kind and generous donations have made this video possible. If you would also like to contribute, please visit us on patreon.com/programmingmadeeasy.